Welcome to the Stanford MBA two-generational wisdom bridge across 30 years. I'm your host, Catherine Keogh McLennan from the MBA class of 1995 of Stanford. In each episode, I bring together one of my classmates, now in our 60s, give or take, and a member of the class of 2025, now in their 30s, give or take, and about to graduate into an entirely different world than we graduated in 1995. Back then, we finished our MBAs just as the internet was emerging. Today's grads are stepping into a future shaped by artificial intelligence, uncertainty, and we hope that we express possibility. These conversations bridge generations, share lessons, and spark reflections on leadership, life, and what's next. Let's dive in. Today, I'm joined by Kevin Steinberg from the Stanford MBA class of 1995 and Michael Bakan from the class of 2025. Kevin is a seasoned executive with over 25 years of operating experience, founding, leading, and scaling some of the world's most prominent professional services and talent-centric organizations. He is currently the founder and chairman of Ascent Leadership Networks, an advisory and executive talent development firm. His past leadership roles include CEO, COO, and president positions at the World Economic Forum, Purpose, Spencer Stuart's leadership consulting practice, and the Brattle Group. Michael is a second-year MBA student, class of 2025 at Stanford. And before business school, he worked in management consulting at Accenture, where he led digital transformation efforts and helped build the firm's financial services sustainability practice. Outside the classroom, Michael brings his passion for sports to life. He helped run a girls' youth basketball program on Nike's Elite Youth Basketball League and recently spent part of his MBA summer working at the historic Royal Dornoch Golf Club in Scotland. Kevin and Michael offer intergenerational perspectives, weaving together lessons from the 90s global business boom with today's tech-infused, socially aware leadership landscape. Kevin reflects on his journey from McKinsey to the World Economic Forum and beyond, emphasizing people strategy, systemic risk, and the evolving role of leadership. Michael, a second-year MBA, shares insights from Stanford's culture of deep interpersonal connection, AI's rising influence, and his own search for meaning, values, and overlooked industries beyond the Silicon Valley bubble. Together, they explore how leadership, purpose, and human connection remain central, even as technology and geopolitics reshape the path forward. Michael, where do we find you on this wonderful Wednesday that's always interesting at Stanford? I can't believe it's still free.
Yes, the wonderful Wednesday of no classes at the GSB. I'm in my apartment at Munger. I love living on campus. It's been a blast. So currently here on campus, enjoying the day off.
Fantastic. And Munger, what is Munger?
Yeah, Munger in reference to the Charlie Munger building, actually right next to the law school. So very close by, just a 10-minute walk from GSB.
And so that's the residence facility. Is that?
It's one of them. So my first year I lived in the actual GSB residences that were just across the street from campus, and then decided to move to another part. So now it's a fun feeling of I'm on campus and get that fun feeling, but feel a little bit more distanced from the first years and from the rest of the GSB.
Kevin, I was talking to Michael before, and he grew up in the area. And were you saying your parents are like a stone's throw?
Yeah, I'm probably one of the few people in my class where the distance between the GSB and where my parents live is closer than the distance between where my parents live and where I went to high school. By just a few miles, but
Have you lived in the area all along, or did you escape for a while and now make your way back?
yeah, I did the classic East Coast tour. So grew up in the Bay Area, went to Georgetown for my undergrad, fell in love with DC, and was telling Kath that I was very much moved by the environment of friends sticking around and said, all right, maybe I'll stay in the DC area for a little bit. So spent 3 years in DC and then had the classic itch of need to get New York out of my system. So went up to New York. Ironically lived with 2 other Michaels. So a house of 3 Michaels in New York.
Love that.
And had a fun little charade up there, and then figured maybe I'll U-turn it back home, and by some way ended up literally back in my backyard.
I love that.
Now, is the itch out of the system? Do you feel like you've had enough New York and DC, or what happens from here?
We were debating that earlier. I told myself prior to GSB that I'd come back to New York. I told the Michaels that save a spot for me in the next apartment, but we'll see. It's weird. I've loved being back home in the Bay Area for personal reasons and professional. But then there's a part of me that loves the newness, and maybe I'll end up somewhere else. We'll see.
Kevin, where are you? What are
So
you
I'm
up
based
to?
in the Boston area, so on the East
Ah,
Coast, and
okay.
have been in different parts of the world. But the Bay Area is great, but I love the East Coast as well. So I figure you can't go wrong, and just have to figure it out before they put another Michael in the room.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, Kevin. Did you grow up in Boston?
I didn't. I grew up in Montreal.
Montreal. Okay. And, again, we could say something about Canada and the US, but we might come back to that. So
The discussion has gotten more heated in terms of
it certainly
Canada-US
has.
relations.
And have you given up your citizenship?
I haven't, so I'm a dual citizen now. I became an American citizen, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, and so, maybe have a little bit of perspective from both sides of the border.
Yeah, it's interesting temptation, I would imagine, for some of you, Kevin, but Boston's a fantastic place. So are you tempted to return to Canada?
The answer is, I haven't been in any rush, but 2 of my 3 kids are fleeing the borders over the coming
Are
months, I
they?
should say,
You're
to start,
kidding.
both the 2 of my 3 will be starting graduate school in Canada and the UK as of September, and, they would say there's a little bit of a political comment. They were thinking about grad school anyway, but there's a little bit more complexity in that discussion these days.
So, Michael, what is life like? What do you guys have? 3 months left or something like that. Is that about right? April, May, June. What is the current mindset that you're facing in as you come to this wonderful adventure that's going to finish?
It's weird. It's sort of an eerie time. And for those of us, including myself, that are figuring out the next steps professionally, it's this weird balance of loving the GSP because it's such a great place to dream and to think big and to try new things out. And then a little bit of like the rubber hits the road of, all right, we need to find a job. How do we tactically make that happen? It's also, I've noticed a little bit of a shift in the class around there's sort of this question of who do I want to bring with me from the GSB, and
Ah,
recognizing that location will affect that. Especially for someone like myself, I find it sometimes hard to maintain those relationships across distance. But
yeah.
it's been the first time where I've noticed the shift of rather than like, hey, let's go out and do these big group things. Let's just go for a walk on a Tuesday evening. Let's go talk about how we're feeling. And so it's kind of been this cool time of a lot of like deepening of relationships in a new way too.
Isn't it awesome, Kevin? I mean, I live in Sydney, for goodness sake. So, and I have my dearest friends. Kevin, you must have kept up with everybody in terms of the network.
So I'll say this. I think I have good news for you, which is I don't think the clock runs out 3 months from now on your ability to think big or to try different things. So one of the lessons maybe from those that are closer to their 30th reunion than their first is that, you'll change careers, you'll change locations, you'll try big things and small things and all that's well and good. And I think the other thing too is it's not a binary decision now who you keep in touch with and who you don't. So there'll be classmates that you don't see for a long time, and then you're back in touch, and others that you stay close to the whole time. But 2 weeks ago, I was at the 60th birthday party of a 95 classmate, and there were 6 or 7 of us there, and
Who's
some
that, Kevin? Who's
it was
that?
for Jeff School.
Ah, fantastic. Oh,
And,
fantastic.
some of us were in close touch all along, and some of us hadn't caught up quite as much, but it was nice to spend time with everybody regardless. And
Aw.
so the deadline of graduation seems like a big momentous one when you go from before to after, but there's a lot of bumps and variations and good and bad things and exciting things that'll happen thereafter too. So all good stuff to come.
But I love the way, Michael, that you're connecting to people. But what is it about Stanford that allows us to do that?
I've been thinking about this a lot. One of the great joys I've had of like opportunities on campus is that I'm pretty involved with Admit Weekend and serve as one of the Admit Weekend co-chairs. It's a whole team, but I have the joy of being able to sort of like see that whole process, and it means that end up talking to a lot of admits or end up talking to a lot of classmates about this like GSB boiled down version, across the admit weekend. And there's like environmental things, and then there's sort of the interpersonal people side. I'll say for myself, some of my favorite memories of GSB are by virtue of living in the residences and having this community on touch. I joke that some of my favorite memories are literally walking my first year, I think the first or second week. One of my closest friends now, his name ironically is also Michael, and I promise all my friends aren't named Michael.
We're getting skeptical on that front, Michael, but keep going.
Exactly. I know. We were walking up the stairs in JMac in one of the residences, and we just ran into each other. We're like, hey, do you want to go shoot pool on the roof? And this was like 9 o'clock. And then fast forward, it's 1 a.m. and we're just hanging out, watching the stars, talking about life. And there's something about just like the physical environment of being able to have more spontaneous moments, I think, lent to that. And then there's something else that I've loved about the focus on just the interpersonal. There's so many moments of, in the first few months of the GSB, I probably knew more about people's lives, but like had no idea what they did for work. And that was a cool way to get to know them. And there's someone in sort of the whole Admit Weekend team that says this line that I think is worthwhile. It's sort of been the motto, which is like, it's change lives, change organizations, change the world. I love how it's change lives first, and it's not change strategy or change the capital structure or whatever. I've always liked how there's a focus on people first here.
Yeah, people first. Now, Kevin, that's been your deal for the last, I don't know if it's all your career, but you certainly have done some amazing leadership and talent services around the world. I love that, of course, because that's my field. But I'd love to hear how you ended up there, because so many of our classmates went, entrepreneurial and came to the top of the mountain. And I'm watching them and seeing how they're climbing.
Well, I'll give the short version of a longer story, and either of you can jump in with any questions. The short version is, after spending a number of years with McKinsey, doing some very traditional post-GSB type of work, ended up going to the World Economic Forum, where I actually spent a little bit of time before the GSB, and went to Geneva for what was intended to be a one-year loan or sabbatical from McKinsey to the World Economic Forum. But for a variety of reasons, it was a wonderful experience, both professionally and personally. And the one-year loan turned to 2 and then 3 and then 4. And 4 years into my one-year loan, effectively agreed to leave McKinsey, join the World Economic Forum full-time, move back to North America, and found and lead their North American arm, which was a wonderful opportunity. And I did that for about 8 years longer.
Wow.
And so I got to grow the team, had great impact. We did really interesting work, phenomenal place to be. And when I left, I spent time in a number of professional services firms. One was a social impact focused consultancy called Purpose, where I was the president. I spent very recently, so I'm saying this out of order, a few years as the chief operating officer of the Brattle Group, which is a global economic consultancy. The way I describe it is that's a law firm, but it's made of economists. So they advise on everything to do with legal cases related to economics and damages and antitrust and other related pieces. And spent several years at Spencer Stuart. And at Spencer Stuart, I was the global COO for their consulting arm, which is effectively what they call leadership advisory services. And for those less familiar, what that really means is that 80-90% of the firm spends time replacing executives, and the part of the business that I oversaw spends time making executives more effective at what they do, which is a little bit of a different hat. And then that led to my founding my own firm and recruiting a number of people from Spencer Stuart, from the World Economic Forum, and some other places to do leadership development in a very different way, largely based on experiential modules where you do things like go to Skywalker Ranch and spend time with George Lucas's team on innovation and creativity, or go to a UN facility and focus on stakeholder engagement in the same place where multinational treaties are negotiated. So really fun experiential things. And I'm getting to the end of the story, but during COVID, all that in-person stuff stopped. The firm pivoted to becoming a consulting firm, advising clients to a much greater degree on talent and people strategy. And we're going to come full circle to where you raised the question, which is one of the things I've come to appreciate over time is for many firms, but certainly for big professional services firms, your talent strategy and your corporate strategy are one and the same. So your assets are the people. That's what it's all about. It's probably true for every firm. So my team and I have been spoiled to talk to firms about their strategy, but focus on the people part, not necessarily the cost accounting or the supply chain or some of the other pieces, which, Michael, to your point in summarizing what you remember, even in your short time at the GSB, you remember the people, you don't remember those other things. So I feel like we get to focus on the most fun, most impactful, changing lives part of the equation that you just laid out.
Kevin, you are just singing my songs. I've been singing these for so long. It's nice to see a person that appreciates it. All right.
Likewise.
One of the questions or reflections that I'm so interested in is and I've said this in some of the things I've written, is that, Kevin, when we were graduating in 1995, Netscape went public and we basically entered the world of the internet, even though, of course, it had been going on for many, many years, but it took off. So much took off so fast that it hit 2000, the tech bubble crashed, and we say it's a dot-com crash in 2000. But then, of course, it's grown, and the ability to have large amounts of data, get across all this was sort of our introduction to the information age. You guys are leaving at a very different time. Information is a commodity. And I know in Accenture, I believe you did a lot of digital, I was going to say revolution. Maybe it was digital revolution. But what are you seeing in this world that you're merging? And it would have changed even in the time you were at Accenture, I would imagine, with the AI.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the elephant in the room of pretty much every class and conversation now is AI. I guess what's top of mind, and this is this thread of the people side too. I mean, a takeaway I had from experience in consulting and the thread that's sort of been interesting in the GSB is that uh, the pace of technology is and innovation in that space is rapidly increasing. The tools available at our hands are incredible. The like segmentation of the generalist versus the technical specialist that is getting a little bit more blurred. And perhaps I say this a little bit selfishly, but what I'm excited to see is like where does like the people, the human interaction part interact with the technology, and both in terms of like freeing up time for managers to focus more on the people side to where does communication change from this or access to information and shoot big meta questions around like truth and factual information. So I'm kind of curious leading from a lot of this, and I think a lot of classmates in our discussions are like, all right, it's so cool being here because we're seeing the frontier edge of where tech is being developed. And we're also seeing like the big questions around values and ethical implications and how will the technology actually affect the human interaction part of any sort of business.
So does that gonna push you into a career direction, Michael, where you're looking at that, or what are the threads? Isn't that a terrible question to ask somebody at this point in time in the career search? But anyway,
Yeah.
what are the threads?
Well, I think it's informed the discernment in a few different ways. It's hard not to ignore the AI strategy and PM roles that are kind of coming out there. And I'll be honest, there was a time where there's a little bit of FOMO of like, go check that out. That's where everyone's knocking these days. On the flip side, though, I think it's for me made an interesting other question, which is like, what are the industries that are being overlooked at a place like the GSB that are interesting spaces to be, that are could be disrupted by this technology, but also just like unique places to call home. And I'm kind of curious, given your thoughts on this too, which is like, I think part of what I loved about early in my career was this debate and discernment about where do values and social impact and mission play. And in some ways, it's been interesting being in the Silicon Valley right now, where there's like this big question of where that all fits in the equation. And I'm trying to figure that out right now as well, which is I want to be in a place that makes my heart beat and trying to keep that top of mind as amidst of like all this other stuff that's going around.
I'd love to get your take on this. It almost felt like there was this binary choice. Were you going into high tech? And that could be venture capital or a whole slew of things around Silicon Valley. Or were you going back to, I don't call it the real world, the rest of the world, where there was a feeling like management consulting and Wall Street and all these other places were outside of that bubble? And not that they weren't affected, but they were sort of more traditional things. So you had that choice before you. And I think today that choice is largely gone. In that, if I think about clients that I work with, whether they're in professional services or financial services or elsewhere, they're all thinking about these questions and all think it is very, very relevant to them in the short term. So coming back to your comment of like thinking about values and coming back to how is this going to shape people, I think the interpersonal dynamics are going to change everywhere because of all this technology. And we don't necessarily know how, but we know there's no getting around it. And so I don't think you're going to have that choice. You and your class of like, do I want to go to the high tech world or not? You're just debating between which parts of it, so to speak. And I love your framing of it because it sounds like you're thinking of it in those terms as well. And it might be hard to think about those overlooked places or things that don't touch the GSB because I think almost everything will, even if there's some industries. I don't know, maybe when you get your hair cut, there won't be robots and AI doing that so fast. I don't know.
Who knows? Michael, what when you say overlooked industries, what comes to mind?
Yeah. It's some of the so I took one of my favorite classes was called Formation New Ventures. It was a survey of entrepreneurship. And it was fascinating to learn about manufacturing, industrial supplies, sort of like backbone economies, logistics, trade, this and that, as well as also just things outside of the Silicon Valley. I mean, another realization I've had that's kind of interesting is like learning about the flow of funds and where that affects the entrepreneurship scene. But then also just looking at there's a bunch of really interesting businesses that aren't VC backed and software as a service AI agents that have really interesting people problems. Yeah, everything from like sports has been a place that I've been looking a lot about. I mentioned industrial supplies and manufacturing, particularly in the sort of broader supply chain and political environment that we're in. Even interest in payments a lot. Um, my mom's from the Philippines, and remittance payments were always something that were like top of mind. But learning about wow, what does that mean? Like an interesting space from tech meets human side meets international development. It's also another thing as I realize I get interested in a lot of different things. And yeah,
The rabbit hole or the rabbit. But those are fascinating. I don't hear your classmates yet talk about those fields. The manual supply chain, which is going to be absolutely radically changed if these tariffs do stick, right? So it'll be so fascinating to see the manufacturing sector of the United States. I mean, we've all but deserted manufacturing. We are a services and mining country. But that's going to be, what do you guys think about that? In fact, let me jump to Kevin. When you listen to Michael, what strikes you about what you're seeing in some of your clients that you're working with in the climb the mountains kind of arenas?
Yeah. Well, so your articulation, Michael, I think of trying to think of the other industries beyond, let's call it the Stanford Silicon Valley bubble, and what's happening with all of them is very interesting in the sense that many of the people that I talk to think of themselves as outside of that bubble and thinking about what are all the changing dynamics that are going to affect them going forward. And interestingly, 6 months ago, a year ago, I think a lot of the conversation was very much around how the Silicon Valley bubble was going to influence them. How does AI change the workforce? How does tech enablement take out steps from the supply chain, et cetera? What I think is very recent and very new, and part of this is our political scene, is we're talking about a whole bunch of other risks, whether they're geopolitical or otherwise, that feel like they have a little bit of the last century air to them. Like we're talking about nationalism, we're talking about tariffs, we're talking about populism, we're talking about a whole bunch of things that maybe weren't on our radar as much 10 years ago or 15 years ago, maybe even 2 years ago or 1 year ago. So I think a lot of, at least the perspective I hear is almost the flip of that. It's, well, if we think of that as one set of technological disruption, what are the various elements of systemic risk that are truly going to be disruptive? And nobody thought they went away. No one thought geopolitical risk wasn't sort of high on the agenda. But I'll tell you, between Russia, Ukraine, the Israel, Gaza, the geopolitical things that have flared and seem omnipresent, and maybe we should have been, but I don't think we spent as much time thinking about them 2 years ago, 4 years ago. And so, great questions in the broad sense of if we step back and you think over the arc of your career and the places you might work, the value chains you might touch, and the like, boy, there's a broad set of considerations. And I don't want to say that's fun because a lot of it's disruption that's difficult to deal with, but there's a lot of meaty things for you to sink into at work and personally and in all kinds of other ways, which is exciting too.
Kevin, I mean, Michael, you spent time with Accenture in Washington, which is an interesting reflection of where things are happening. But to Kevin's point, over the last 2 years, have you guys really taken and integrated those geopolitical, those socioeconomic, those things? Because basically, I don't know, Kevin, I loved macroeconomics, but that was the only course that we actually looked at. The rest of it was micro, like you said, micro skills, micro that. How are you guys looking at the world now that's emerging for you to lead?
Sure. No, but the first say, in some ways, I think it's been very hard incorporating that at the GSB. Part of that is distance. Part of that is some cultural things, many things that play there. I'll say for me, what's been powerful though is it's been amazing being on a college campus in this time and seeing the way that Stanford reacts. And one of the things I've loved about having a student idea right now is a chance to go, when an event happens, guess what? There's probably some expert at the Hoover Institute or Stanford's economics department commenting on that. And so it's a little bit of, I think, going sort of beyond the GSB's campus, although there's been ways that they've brought it internally. I'll also say it's been some of my favorite memories have been some of the travel and the more kind of academic meets fun travel. I had the chance to lead a trip with a group of students to Saudi Arabia, and it was focused on some of their investments in sports and tourism, and more broadly, just look at this question of what does economic diversification look like, and at least this modern iteration of that for Saudi Arabia. And it's amazing to find like my favorite moments were the read a headline, then go talk to someone, and kind of debating that at the ground level.
Wow. What was the most surprising thing about Saudi Arabia when you looked at that?
Yeah, it was all, at least in terms of the investments they're making in sports and tourism, like they're gonna happen. And I think uh, there was a lot of like I think going in like what is real, what is fake. I guess a surprising nuance I found was that I think I came in with this narrative of there are like moral implications to this. There are sort of questions around the business case. And then the narrative we heard on the ground was, people can say what they want. We think that we're de-risking opportunities for future investors. And maybe there isn't a business case. Maybe some of these will be extremely powerful, but there's a nuance or a different narrative to learn in that, and realizing that I think I can hold both of those and debate those. But it was powerful to really like to kind of get that on the ground.
You guys are the amazing travelers. Kevin, what do you remember about the international aspects? I don't know if you got to go on. I don't know if we did many trips like the classes do now, but what's the memories of that, Kevin? And plus, being in Geneva, come on, you're like at least at the center of Western Europe anyway.
Well, I guess those are two different things. I'll comment on both, which is we didn't have the same opportunities as today. There were some trips, and a minority of people went on the trips, but the business school is very international in the sense that there was representation from around the world. And so for me, despite being born in Canada and going to school in the States and being in an undergrad that was nominally very international, when I was an undergrad, 10% of the community was international, and that included me, and I didn't consider myself particularly international. The dynamic at the business school was very different, and I think it still is today. And I don't know the numbers. I want to say it's 30-40% people who are born outside of the US. And so, that experience to me of different viewpoints, different perspectives, different experiences, that diversity is phenomenally valuable and interesting. And I still think of that today. Kat, the second part of your question about Geneva and the World Economic Forum, one of the really nice things about the forum is that it's another one of those places that, Mike, like you said, it lets you think about the big picture. And so we would convene people in Davos and elsewhere. And one of the real themes was step back and try to think about what's important at the macro level, not necessarily at the micro level. So I got to oversee a project that was called the Risk Response Network, for example, and it was solely focused on how do you think about risk from a macro perspective? How are all of those risks related? And this was years before, but the example I give now, which is intuitive to everyone, is we had a global pandemic, horrific. But when you think about COVID, the implications were a lot more than just the health impact on society. It reverberated everywhere. And that sort of interdependent systemic risk to me is the biggest picture kind of thinking. And it has implications even today. And not that we couldn't have done this before, but like it feels like a treat for the three of us to be talking over video, recording a podcast. It'll be distributed through all these channels. The truth is, all this technology was available pre-COVID, but odds are that most people weren't using them yet. It really took COVID for video conferencing and working from home and all those changes in dynamics to quickly and dramatically escalate. And to me, I love that example of think through the implications expected and unexpected of all of these societal changes. The way things change isn't necessarily just because the technology is available.
I love that, Kevin. Michael, you're all over it. I mean, when you list sports, payments, and manufacturing and supply chains is an interspersed, an integrationist thinker. And one of the things I'm writing about is our choice right now between going isolation and integration. And my hope is that people that are coming out of Stanford are going to start to do what Kevin is doing, bringing the fields together and working with the socioeconomic political changes as just the fabric that we've got right now. It'll be, I guess the question in there is, are there anxieties? Like, do you guys talk about the anxieties of going into this world? And if you do, what's the flavor of them?
Absolutely. There's now I think a lot of it's situational anxiety of like, there's this menu of options. Where do I start? How do where will this sort of decision point play looking back in 30 years around like the first job out of an MBA? But I will say what's been comforting is one of my favorite, in that class I mentioned, one of my favorite classes, Formation New Ventures, one of the co-teachers of that was Dean Garth Solaner, former dean of the GSB. Yeah. Right? Yeah. I mean, I love seeing that reaction because I didn't really fully appreciate the magnitude of who he was until actually on the last day of class, he gave sort of a last lecture of sorts. And he talked about what he notices in reunions. And essentially what he was saying, he's like kind of calling out, maybe there's some anxiety right now. Part of that's decision, part of that's maybe some fear of where the world's at, a fear of what's around the corner or what does the future look like and how do I make a career out of that. But one of my lessons was when he talked about what it's like to be at the fifth reunion or what he sees in the 10th, et cetera, is sort of this like bifurcation of we go out and kind of do our things, but part of what gives me comfort and hope is the chance to then come back together. And whether that's in careers, whether that's in personal life, you name it. I found that one of my like first memories of GSB is doing a finance case that was brutal. And I was so annoyed by it and it gave me anxiety. But then three GSBers came together and somehow we figured it out and had a lot of fun along the way. And I'm hoping that maybe is a bit of a metaphor of the next 5 to 10 years of like, in the short term, it feels a little scary, but maybe in the 5th, 10th reunion, there's some way to bring back together and do cool things with good people.
Kevin, so you go to a 60th birthday of one of our classmates. What do you notice about the types of conversations and, I don't know, anxieties, hopes?
So I'll say this, and the thing, by the way, about your comment, Michael, that made me smile was working it all out by the 5th or 10th reunion. Because I think we're months away from our 30th. I don't think we've worked it out yet, at least most of us. So, I think part of the journey is realizing that you either won't have to or don't work it out. That's perfectly fine. But I will sort of say, with a little bit of retrospection, I do think that there's an element of the first 5-10 years when you're embarking on your career and you're probably thinking about, financially, what does it mean? Where do you want to live? Thinking about family choices. There's a bunch of things that are consequential in terms of choices. And I'm not saying you can't change roles, because you can. And I'm not saying your family situation won't evolve. It certainly will. And geographically, maybe you'll be back on the East Coast in DC or New York, maybe not. But none of those are really locked down. But I will say that I think the worry about those things clearly fades over time. And I don't know if it's by the 20th or the 25th or the 30th, but there's a different feel to the reunions from sort of trying to figure those things out to having conversations about things that people are passionate about. And most of the time, it's not about like where you're working at that moment or whether you've achieved something on your checklist. So the good news is I think that tension goes away. I'm just saying it may not go away because it's resolved. It may go away because at that point it doesn't matter.
What is going to happen this week at Stanford that you're most excited? Bring us back to the time of our Stanford experience 30 years ago. What's going on?
Yeah. Well, it's the end of the quarter, and I joke that I don't think I've finished an end of a quarter well, in part because it's hectic and there's group projects and this and that and distractions. But life is wonderfully chaotic right now. Maybe I'll describe like what's going on today, which is that somehow I don't have class, but somehow the day gets filled. And I always joke that some of my favorite moments at the GSB are a day when I'll sit down at night and do a journal entry or something. It's like this feeling of like a whiplash of both the context switching, but also this like laughter to intense intellectual stimulation to perhaps even sadness and emotional connection to, whoa, like I didn't think I'd meet that celebrity founder person talking with Kevin today. And so, literally a moment like today, I'm going, I'm a part of a leadership fellowship, the Arbuckle Leadership Fellowship on campus. And so I'm doing a coaching session with a first year MBA. And never in my life did I be thinking at this point in time, I'd be spending several hours a week thinking about what does it mean to be a leadership coach. But I think that's like so unique and special. Um, and then there's an LPF later tonight. So a social event that'll be fun to hang out with some classmates a little bit. I'm catching up with an alum who graduated last year. So already love that that connection is happening. And then talk is tonight for the MBA twos. A dear friend of mine is giving her talk tonight. So we're poster making and making signs to support her and cheer her on as she shares her story in this beautiful forum. So I think today is going to be one of those days where it's like a little all over the place. And what's interesting too is like I was talking to some classmates right now where even as second year MBAs at the end of the quarter, like rarely when we talk about our week does like the C word of career come up. Um, and that's kind of interesting. And I go back and forth on how that sits and how that feels. But the favorable interpretation I have about it right now, it's like it's so cool that I and we are spending time with each other, supporting classmates at talk, doing things that are intellectually interesting. I guess trusting that that stuff will come later down the line.
Oh, I love that.
Nice. Well,
Kevin, what are you? Yeah, go.
I was going to say that the listeners can't see, Kath, that you're smiling. And I think it's not just because Michael's thinking that you're a celebrity podcast founder. Michael, love your noting that like nobody ends the quarter well, or that you've never ended the quarter well. I love the image of like the whole class is just limping over the finish line 3 times a year. I think there's some deep truth in that. And because it's everyone crams in everything they possibly can. And so you're just doing as much as seems humanly possible. So by definition, you're sort of just making it to the finish line. I think that's a great and very telling sort of metaphor for the GSB experience in so many ways.
Love, but it is. But what I also love, is the coaching that you guys are learning and the speaking that you guys are learning from when I talk to your classmates. It's such a huge emphasis on the skills of those, the people skills. Kevin, we only had leadership as a concept introduced to us in the last year, I believe. And look, we had a thing called organizational behavior, which sounds like rats, but that there wasn't that much, Michael. I'm just delighted. So learning about coaching, learning about teaching. What's the most challenging aspect of the people side of the equation that you're starting to see? And you would have had some Accenture ones as well.
Yeah. Well, um, Dean Solana had a great line about in that same last lecture about sort of like building resilience more or less when stakes are low and using this as an interesting time to sort of take those risks. And I found out like, in many ways in coaching or even just the leadership side, the like I even feel like a heartbeat getting nervous at times when it happens of like what does it look like to lean in conflict? What does it look like to hold something really emotional from someone and learning how to respond to that? Creating space for all those different things. And so I found those to be like beautifully challenging in a way that it's uncomfortable, and in some ways too, there's like this air of relationship management and wanting to manage that, but also getting into it with classmates. But it's still incredibly valuable because I think I'm going to look back in 30 years and say, well, I'm glad I kind of at least began to start to figure that out as a student. And I'm also kind of curious, Kevin, your perspective on like, as you deal with leaders as well, like the things and tools that you lean on.
Yeah. So I'll say this to grossly generalize in a way that's probably unfair. Most of the leaders that I know, not all, but many, have risen to their positions not because of their management or leadership excellence, but because of their sort of functional excellence. And what I mean by that is they became the global CFO because they were really good at the financial elements of their job, not necessarily because they were great leaders. And so you end up with this sort of generic, like, the best litigator leads the law firm. The best surgeon leads the hospital group. The best academic at research ends up leading the university. And you go through all these examples. And so part of what I find interesting is your comments really focus much more on what I would consider the leadership elements or competencies or skills. We want to get a little bit more of the technical terms, as opposed to the functional skills and the like. And so none of us have talked about the importance of financial accounting. It matters. It's a key course at the GSB. I'm not knocking it, but it's probably not what you're thinking about in terms of how you're going to change lives and change organizations. And it's probably not the things that will make you an exceptional leader. So I'm delighted to hear you talk about some of those other types of skills, which I would put into the leadership bucket, as opposed to there's a functional things you need to go through before you graduate. So you've seen, the range of different competencies and skills that'll serve you well.
Yeah, it's awesome, Michael. I don't remember it, Kevin. And maybe my mind is going. I just don't remember talking too much about the people orientation. The one thing, Kevin, that you mentioned was the strategic notion of talent and talent development. I have been trying to tell private equity and venture capital over here to use my services because I can look at companies in the way, and I've shared this story a couple of times. Well, I had an investment class with Professor Van Horn, God bless him, and Warren Buffett came as a guest, and we asked him, so what are you investing in, of course? And he said, well, I'm not investing in those technology stocks. I'm going to invest in those hard steel cap boots when I can look the person in the eye. Now, of course, once it got settled, he could look in the eye, he became Bill Gates, etc. But that's interesting. So when you see people, these guests like Salar and all the guests, what is the common thing that you leave with the people that are leading great businesses? What's the messages that they're leaving with you?
That's for me.
Yeah, Michael,
Yeah.
you're our hope. We just want you to go and
It's
give
too
us
late
hope.
for us.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a couple of things, and maybe the first one that's come up more recently in some ways of that response to what you're saying, Kevin, about the kind of functional expertise as well. A couple of the classes in the last quarter were debating this like warmth versus competence dilemma, and like, do I lead with strength and lead with sort of the competence, or lead with warmth? And I think I came in feeling like a little bit polar, and it's been fun to talk to leaders that say you can kind of do both, and the ability to sort of hold both in various different situations and having that flexibility can be a powerful skill. And that's been, I think, a takeaway at times when even when I feel maybe out of the room skill set wise in terms of competence, for the other things I can lean on to be influential. Another thing that's come up as well in some of the leaders is like trying is noble. It's worthwhile trying. And that can be a powerful thing, whether that's taking a bet on self, a space, something else, values, you name it. And then another theme that's I think also been big for my second year as well is that in some of the leaders and speakers that have come to class, um, there's just a sense of humility, like knowing when to say I don't know and knowing when to ask for help, knowing when to lean on people. I think first year in some ways was a little bit of this like pedestalizing of leaders. Second year has been this kind of cool, like no longer a love letter to entrepreneurship or leaders, but realizing that things are tough, and getting a little bit of a glimpse of like how to handle the tough moments has been powerful.
Michael, that is fantastic. Let's then roll back a little bit, Kevin. As you look back over the 30 years, and this is always hard for us because we don't think 30 years has passed. When we look at you, you're the same age.
Right.
We're right with you.
We look no different, Michael, just to be clear.
No. We
I love
don't.
it. I'm
Like,
seeing it
it's
here.
exactly the same.
Sorry, that's why this is a podcast just as well.
But if you look over the last 30 years, you bring yourself back to Michael's, think of our graduation ceremony or whatever sticks out in those last couple of months. And you look here. This is such a hard question, but what is the fundamental 2 to 3 lessons when you take the world of Stanford and you put the world of Kevin today? And how have you brought those with you over the last 30 years?
So that's a great question. And it's funny because I probably would answer it differently today than 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So there's definitely an element of circumstance to that. But I'll say this. I mentioned earlier some of my journey from McKinsey World Economic Forum to doing a lot more in terms of leadership development and working with executives on how they can make their organizations more effective. And in a way, I feel like I've almost come full circle because now I work with a number of different companies as clients that do a number of different things. And so that diversity of perspectives in some ways is more valuable now than when I was in an executive role in a particular company focusing on something that was much more narrow and specific. And so I find, at least with the benefit of hindsight, some of, Michael, what you referred to as like thinking the big picture, being able to sort of get away from that day to day to be enormously valuable. And it's part of why I actually enjoy even more talking to classmates, talking to faculty, talking to people involved with the GSB, because they have all of those broad perspectives. And just to illustrate, I'm working with a billion-dollar large PR and communications firm. It's not a space where I necessarily spent a lot of time until the past year, but actually relying on people I know, the networks I've built and the like, to get insights has been great. And so I'll say the 30-year version of that answer is there's something really nice about the people, the network, the broad perspectives, all those interpersonal things that you spoke about that I now find even more value in than I necessarily did when I was in my narrower focused, mentality of my fifth reunion when I was at McKinsey and I was doing financial services and it felt like the blinders were still on because I was focusing on something very specific.
Isn't that true, Kevin? And what's it's network, and not just for career, but, one of our classmates dies and we have to reach out to each other to understand the implications of that. One of our classmates goes bankrupt. There's many of our classmates that have gone bankrupt. One of our classmates loses their home in the fires just recently. And this hits the heart of, wow, getting emotional here. It hits the heart of who we really are. And I think the question of who I really am, which I don't think we ever answer, by the way, just is wonderful to celebrate with that playing pool and going up on the roof and just being around till 1:00 we all have forms of that. And it's just so special. So let's wrap this up in that say, what's your biggest hope, Michael, going out? What's your biggest hope? It can be for a personal, for the world. What comes to mind if I say hope?
Yeah, it's the first word that pops to my mind is accompaniment. And I think that whether that's the GSB, whether that's intergenerational conversations like this, I think a learning I have that's really top of mind is that following people in heart and like doing things together is what makes my heart beat and gives me a lot of joy. And having even been at times that felt more lonely, I think what always was powerful in that was having people to walk a path together. And so what gives me hope is that for myself and in this period of time with everything going on, that there's potentially a bid for connection and a bid for accompaniment.
Fantastic word. Kevin, hope.
Hope. Well, I'll give my hope for Michael first, and maybe I'll give our hope for us,
Yes.
because I feel like there's two things there. So, Michael, my hope for you, as you phrase this, is that A, you sort of find yourself enjoying the journey and not only thinking about the people with you on the journey and the destination. Because in some sense, I think that's what it's all about. And the GSB network are people who will be on your journey and supporting you and part of it. And whether it works out or not almost doesn't matter. I mean, I hope it does. If there's bumps along the way, I very much agree with sort of enjoying the journey and being accompanied by people. It's hard to go wrong if that's the case, even if nominally it feels off the rails. Anyway, my hope for us too, Kath, in the sort of 30th anniversary perspective is that we don't lose any of the eagerness that Michael is displaying, because I think there's always this chance that we start talking about the things we wanted to do and didn't have a chance to do and the like. And we're still like all of that opportunity is still open for us in all kinds of ways. So we have to just live up to that and keep your advice in mind too.
I love it. And you know what, Michael? I guess maybe I'll end with this is that's what, if it's a real interchange between our generations, I just want to thank you guys because you've just opened up so much energy and so much curiosity. What can we do for you?
Wow. And I want to play back that gratitude. Maybe I'll say that it's in the theme of accompaniment. I'm thinking of this question of what's next, and the theme that I've loved hearing about this is that it seems like it's a constant question. And so one, I would love accompaniment as I figure that out, but also perspective and I get a lot of joy of hearing stories of like the pattern recognizing across of that. Like, gosh, Kevin, there's probably 20 things of notes I have that are going in my GSB learnings journal just from this conversation alone. And that comes with a lot of gratitude and respect. And so accompaniment in the sense of shared perspective and discerning that like what's next? How do I make that next question would be very valuable.
That's awesome.
That's
And
a
Kath,
great.
I wonder if, I don't know what the plans are for the podcast, the series, how many, how often, whatever, but it does feel like there's some culmination of this where a group of the 30th and a group of the soon to be graduating can actually have a conversation along these lines. It's sort of the Adam Grant give and take perspective of how do we just support each other and accompany, right? So I love that notion.
It's a great way to end because I think I've got 20. And I'm going to start releasing them next week. I've got 4 stocked up, so I want to release one every week because the sharing is so rich, and it's the topics, the energy. I am pumped about what you guys are going out to do. It's so varied, and it is the integration part where AI is not. You're not going out to do AI. You're doing AI to solve Medicaid, one of your classmates. You're doing AI to solve some of the environmental issues. You're using AI to do something. And you guys are just fantastic. So noted, Kevin. We'll have to reclaim them from wherever they are, except if they're doing their double law degree, in which case, they're still going to be hanging around. We might have to pull some of those guys. But thank you guys. I really what a wonderful conversation.
Outstanding. Well, such a pleasure meeting you, Michael, and Kath. Thanks. Hats off to you for putting these together. And I'll look forward to hearing the final version and the other ones as they get released too.
I love it. Thank you for joining us. For more insights and information, visit my website at katherinemclennan.com. That's spelled KATHRINEMCLENNAN.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the series so you know when the next episode will be as we continue exchanging wisdom, connecting past, present, and future through the perspectives of Stanford MBA graduates of 1995 and 2025.